Hello, and welcome to episode 7 of my podcast, Refining Rhetoric. I'm Robert Bortons, your host. Today's episode includes an interview with Mike Donnelly, where we will discuss the challenges homeschoolers around the world are facing. After that, I'll do a brief recap and unpack a few of the tools of learning from our interview, and then we'll have our second current event discussion on energy. And finally, Will McCreary will dive into NFTs, non-fungible tokens. Let's get started.
School Conversation Studios presents Refining Rhetoric with CEO Robert Bortons, a podcast where faith, business, politics, and classical education meet. Join us as we use the classical tools of rhetoric to seek truth in every arena of life.
Mike Donnelly serves as HSLDA's senior counsel to members in 7 states and is director of global outreach, which coordinates HSLDA's support of homeschooling freedom around the world. He and his wife, Patricia, are homeschooling parents of 7 children. Mike's previous experience includes combat service during the First Persian Gulf War as a United States Army cavalry officer, private legal practice, and is a founder of a nationally ranked internet marketing firm. HSLDA provides over 100,000 member families with peace of mind knowing that they don't have to homeschool alone. Whether it's legal representation, educational counseling, practical resources, or grants for struggling families, HSLDA says that everything they do flows from their core mission of making homeschool possible. Mike, welcome to the show.
Robert, it's a real honor to be with you today.
Now, I just saw an article that you and your wife have done something to an old schoolhouse. Can you tell us a little bit about your homeschooling experience and what you guys just finished?
Goodness. Oh my goodness, you're dredging that up, huh? Well, okay.
You posted it.
I did. Well, I had to. Yes, we were on the front page of the Martinsburg Journal. I mean, after the New York Times, it's the Martinsburg Journal, baby. So yeah, my wife had this vision to move into this old schoolhouse that was built in the early 1900s. It's a very interesting structure. People can find it. It's not hard to find. It's the Kearneysville Schoolhouse in Kearneysville, West Virginia, which is where we live. And we moved in 2019. It was supposed to be a 1-year project. We moved out in we just moved out. You're looking at your watch, Robert. Yep, exactly. And so I did most of the work myself. So, if I ever, stop being a lawyer for HSLDA, I guess I can go into the contracting business. Anyway, it was a fun project most of the time. But now so the vision was to turn this thing into an Airbnb, which we have done. And it's been serving people who are coming to the Kearneysville, West Virginia area for some months now. So thanks for asking about it.
Yes, that's awesome. A single room schoolhouse. And of course, that's dear to our heart here at Classical Conversations. Now, what do you do at HSLDA, and specifically talking about your role in global outreach?
Well, before we get onto that, I have to go back to this schoolhouse story too, because there's some guys who are asking themselves, "Uh-oh, I'm in trouble now. What am I going to do if my wife asked me to do that?" So it was one of those things that I didn't want to do at first, but my wife just had this vision, and Robert, you know what it's like. When you have a vision, whether it's the wife or you have a vision and, you have to follow that vision. And I figured, my wife has had 7 children. She's a homeschooling mom. How can I say no?
Yeah.
One of the things I say to dads who ask me, what's the most important thing you can do? And we're probably jumping ahead a little bit for your wife or as a homeschool dad. And here's one of the things I say is just sign the check. Just sign the check, guys. If your wife wants it and it's within your budget, and it's going to help your homeschool and it's going to help your marriage, then sign the check. That's what we do. That's one of the things we do. I mean, obviously we have to be good stewards of the resources God has given us, but
it's an investment.
It's an investment, and we have to be sensitive to, God uses our wives, and I'm sure you could tell stories to shape us Romans 8:28 says all things happen for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And that includes our wives and our kids.
They're usually the better part of us.
That's exactly right. Anyway, so sorry about that, but I just wanted to jump off of that. And I just wanted to, because my wife is going to listen to this. She listens to my podcasts too. So I have to be really, aware of what I'm saying.
Your wife's awesome, and you've got awesome kids. And so out of the 7, how many are still in the house?
We have 3 still at home. Our 4 oldest are either graduated from college or in college, and we have 3 still at home. Our youngest is 11. That's Josh, who's, my buddy. Hey, Josh.
It's awesome. I mean, having kids and growing up is so much fun. And I know, we're on the younger spectrum, 7, 5, and almost 2, although sometimes we think the 7-year-old's going on 14, but it's amazing how fast it goes. And I've enjoyed getting to meet your kids and see them growing up and turning into the wonderful young men and women that they are. Back to you. What do you do at HSLDA and global outreach? What does that entail?
Well, I am so privileged, Robert, to serve the homeschool community. And I also just want to take time to thank you and Classical Conversations for your support. It's been such a blessing to watch Classical Conversations grow, and it's had such a positive impact for so many people here in the U.S., but also around the world. I mean, when we talk about global outreach, I mean, you guys have a very active global operation, and you've been with us here at HSLDA helping support our vision to support the global homeschool movement from the very beginning. As sponsors of our global conferences, and we just really appreciate you and the heart you have for the homeschool community. So thank you to you and your mom and your company, your staff, and everybody there at CC. We appreciate you very much.
Well, you guys had the vision and the execution, and just, we were privileged to be able to come alongside of you and work on helping families in Germany and Brazil and Russia and of course all over the world now. And it's been fun to work with you and alongside you all in this effort, because the freedom to homeschool shouldn't be something that's just here in the United States, but it's something that God gave and really commanded parents to do. And we need to be fighting for that freedom around the world, and obviously continue to do it here at home.
Well, we do. And when you talk about fighting for freedom, I wonder if any of the people listening to this podcast are like, what are you talking about? Fighting for freedom? I mean, I'm homeschooling, everything's fine, right? But I don't think a lot of our American homeschool friends, the new ones especially, and I certainly didn't understand this because I went to public school and I'd never heard of homeschooling until my oldest son was like 3 years old. So I was like, yeah, I mean, I like the idea. It made a lot of sense to me as a new Christian, wanting to make family the center of my life. But I never really gave much thought to the whole fight for freedom. But having been involved in advocacy work now for over 15 years here in the United States, but also globally, I can tell you that there is a fight for freedom going on. I mean, Reagan said it so well. He said, we do not pass on freedom to our children in the bloodstream when we have children. It is something that we have to fight for, and they then have to fight for to preserve for themselves. So because freedom is not the natural state of things. I mean, people, if we remember our history, the United States, 250 some years old, this idea of freedom and democracy and a republic and rights, that's not the norm in human history. So freedom is not the norm. And so it's something that we do have to fight for to preserve. And so, if you're listening to this podcast and you're homeschooling the United States of America, you need to realize that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the pioneers, like Mrs. Borton's, Lee Borton's was one of the pioneers. They had to make a decision. Are they willing to go to jail for their convictions? And those are the same questions that some people in other countries have to ask themselves. Are they going to flee their country? Are they going to fight against the state like in Germany or Sweden and risk losing their children? Those are the kinds of questions. Those are the kinds of decisions that those people had to make. I had the Romica family on my podcast recently, and you've been on my podcast and the Homeschooling Around the World podcast, which people can listen to. And I hope they will go and listen to the podcast that I had with you, but also the Romica family, which is an incredible story. You've been to Germany. I think you've met the Romicas.
Yes.
Yeah. And they left everything so they could come and homeschool their kids because they believe that strongly in it. So this is a freedom that we can't take for granted. There is a fight for freedom that we have to be prepared to engage in at all times.
going over to Germany for the very first Global Home Education Conference. And of course, you guys picked that out because of the fight that has to be had there. I mean, you go there and, they think they're a democracy. They talk about all these freedoms they have, but the fundamental freedom to educate their children is one that's denied to them. I mean, literally meeting people who had their children taken from them for months, years, forever, getting massive fines, people who are visiting the country without their kids because they had fled previously. And this is in Germany, who's quote unquote our ally. So
I know, right? With friends like these, who needs, whatever.
So what do you see going across the world globally? Has COVID made more people interested in homeschooling, less people interested? I mean, we kind of know how it was dealt with over here in the United States. I mean, what have you seen across the world?
Well, as you can imagine, everything was turned upside down. 1.4 billion kids were denied their schooling because the schools were closed. And then it's taken 2 years for some countries to even reopen their schools. For example, Uganda is just reopening their schools. And so what we did see is a lot of interest in home education all over the world. Here in the US, of course, you know the story. It's doubled or tripled, grown fastest among minority communities, Hispanic, Black families, homeschooling at rates that we've never seen before, which is really exciting. And as you can imagine, as these movements in other countries are growing, the authorities are getting concerned because, in America, even though it may not always look like it or feel like it, we do have a lot of freedom here. And there is a DNA of freedom in our country's culture. Even when we look around and we're like, really? Seriously, freedom? I mean, but when you compare what we have to some other countries, we have a lot of freedom here. And when I look at what's happening in Europe, it's particularly concerning. Over the last 2-3 years, we've seen European countries going backwards on homeschooling, where they've had homeschooling recognized legally, and now they're imposing additional and increasingly unreasonable restrictions. For example, in France, 2 years ago, President Macron saying, no, we want every child in school because it's where you learn values of the Republic. And we're not going to allow people to homeschool. And, it had been a right in France since the 1880s for people to homeschool, and it was recognized as a right.
Mm-hmm.
Now they have to ask for permission. In England, the ruling parties there are talking about imposing unreasonable registration requirements, and they're trying to go after homeschoolers because they don't trust them. And, in Portugal, you have to have a college degree to homeschool. That was a new restriction that was imposed. In Ireland, the authorities there have sneakily imposed new restrictions and requirements. And Germany and Sweden, there's been virtually no progress. It's as bad as it's ever been. Hungary has gone backwards. So there's a lot of places in Europe that are going backwards. A few places that are, holding steady, like Italy, Spain, although it's not recognized as legal in Spain. They don't go after people. Finland,
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty recognized. Russia, you can homeschool there, which, you and I were there a few years ago in Moscow and St. Petersburg, Robert, and I thought that was incredible. I mean, as I trained as a soldier in the United States Army in the 80s, I was training to fight with Soviet soldiers. And now the Soviet Union, the evil empire, as Ronald Reagan called it, is gone, and people can homeschool there. So it's interesting. There are places where there is this freedom. You look at South America or Latin America, we see some growth in homeschooling there, which is exciting. And you see it too, because you have communities popping up all over the place.
Yeah, we're in, I think, over 50 countries. I'm not sure if it's 52 or 53 or 54 now, and got interest in a few more. And, we've definitely seen a tremendous amount of new interest. And it's always funny in a sad way, to hear these countries banning or making it harder to homeschool when they've literally forced their citizenry to do it over the last 2 years because they wouldn't open the schools. So this doesn't make any sense. So you're a member too. So there's HSLDA, and then there's Global Home Education Exchange. So tell us a little bit about what that is.
Well, sure. HSLDA is we do have international members, and we serve American homeschoolers. 98% of our members are from the United States. And, we want people to feel confident in homeschooling. And we're watching legislatures, we're watching, what's happening in local communities, state legislatures, the federal level as well to make sure that nobody messes with the homeschoolers. We've got your back, homeschooling community. You can trust us. But, so Global Home Education Exchange is a global network that we support that brings together communities from all over the world, focusing really on leaders because you've got to have organizations in countries to advocate for homeschool freedom. Homeschool families here and there can do it, but it's really, really tough. And, when it's a very small community, they feel very isolated, kind of like it was way back in the USA. Not anymore. We've got any number of communities here in the US, so there's no reason for people to feel isolated here in the US.
Right.
But overseas, there are places where they can feel very alone. And so we're working to support the development of leaders. We're supporting research in these countries. We are reaching out to policymakers to provide them with research, to provide them with good arguments and good practices about why homeschooling is good for communities, why it's good for countries. I mean, look, if homeschooling is good for kids, which it is, it's good for families. And if it creates strong families, which it does, that creates strong communities. And strong communities creates strong cultures, strong countries. So it's a very logical thing. But unfortunately, a lot of these policymakers they're confused because they're looking at the last 200 years of this experiment that we've had with compulsory school attendance and government-run education. And, we could talk about that for hours. But they're confused. And so we have to kind of go in there, remind them that, it's not that weird for parents to teach their kids. We've been doing this for thousands of years, okay? And actually, when you look at places where we've been doing it for decades and decades, the research shows that it works really good. So, and by the way, it saves you billions of dollars. So why don't you want to do this other than you want to control everybody, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I do talk to politicians here in the United States, and they're like, of course, school choice is a big topic right now. And of course, they first think like, yeah, I'm a big school choice proponent. And I'm always like, well, here's my article on school choice versus school choice. But really, I think what the best thing you could do is just end compulsory education laws, because if you don't mandate education, then homeschooling every form of education becomes legal overnight. And parents can definitely choose what's best for their kids. And of course, a lot of those laws hurt the most vulnerable in society. But, what are some stories that should encourage our families internationally that you've heard recently?
Well, Robert, it's a constant battle. I mean, there are 200 countries, everyone's behind the United States in terms of recognizing the legality of homeschooling or affirming that homeschooling is a good thing. I mean, like I said, in Europe, they're moving in the wrong direction. Even in Latin America and South America, there's a fight going on. So I'd love to point to a lot of positive things. So one area, Panama legalized homeschooling, recognized the legality of homeschooling, but they're suspicious. That is the natural tendency of these governments, is to be suspicious of something that they can't control. That's really the forward edge of the battlefield, if I can use that terminology. That's the issue that we really need to confront. And we're trying to confront that in a lot of different ways. I mean, the United Nations is one of those entities that has a big impact globally. They're confused on this issue. They're very statist. I just read the most recent Global Education Monitoring Report, and they've now, for the last 2 years, at least mentioned homeschooling. They had never mentioned it before. But when they do, they mention it kind of suspiciously. Last year they wrote about how homeschooling is a challenge to inclusion, or this year they're saying, well, homeschooling grew, but it had these gender disparities and it affected the workforce participation of women because, most moms are the ones who are doing the homeschooling. And I'm like, guys, can you not focus on what's really the issue, which is let's look at how we can educate kids, especially during a global pandemic? There's a lot of things that are happening. I'm excited about that. Homeschooling is growing. There's a lot of people getting involved. That's very positive. And we're having a conversation, which for me, 10 years ago, that was my goal. I wanted to try to help facilitate and create conversations because I felt like If we could do that, there's no way homeschooling can lose because the truth will eventually win. And the truth of homeschooling is that it works really well.
I think that we should have a study on the greenness of homeschooling, because clearly homeschooling is the most green form of education. And that's a thing that is very sustainable. It's something that the UN and some of these countries could help. Maybe we could get some carbon offset credits for these families, and you could get like Amazon or some of these airplane companies to pay you to homeschool to offset their maybe get Leonardo DiCaprio and his jets and boats to offset, all those smog that he's creating, and pay some homeschoolers some green credits. But I digress.
Well, you poke. No, actually, you think you digress. How much carbon does a school bus emit? How many school buses are traveling around emitting carbon dioxide and whatever else they emit? School buildings, I mean, it's like a plant. So, for those who are moved by that argument, I've actually done some calculations on this, actually, because when you're doing global work, you have to kind of speak the language that's meaningful. And to some people, this sustainable development conversation is important. And you can actually make some headway with people on this issue, believe it or not.
Yeah, I did a quick math in North Carolina. I think we'd have to build 70 schools overnight, like have 10,000 new buses, and of course the staff to run all these, and the gasoline to power them, and all of those sorts of things. So yeah, it's maybe that's what we need to do to get international freedom for homeschooling. As a father, what are some advice that you have for maybe dads that are listening to our podcast today? You said, write the check, or, invest in your wife, really invest in your family in ways that, she can see that maybe you're not, because you're, the primary breadwinner for the family. But what are some other things that they can do?
Well, I think it's really important for dads to be there, to be engaged. And that's what I've tried to do. We all make mistakes, and I've made a lot, and you can't avoid making mistakes. But what you can do is you can seek out advice from people. And early on, when I was a startup entrepreneur, working 70, 80 hours a week at that internet marketing firm, and I was a new Christian, I realized that there was something out of sync. And I don't remember if I came up with this or someone smarter than me. It was probably somebody smarter than me who suggested this to me. But the good can be the enemy of the great. And that's some advice I've given to a lot of people along the line. And they've come back to me and said, that was really meaningful to me. So, there's a lot of good things that we can do as fathers, but we're the only person who can be the husband of our wife or the father of our children. And sadly, there are situations where, there are some moms listening right now who have lost, the husband either through death or through divorce or other situations. But that's not God's best. But for those of us who are dads and we're fathering our family, let's remember that. There's lots of people who can be a worship leader. There's lots of people who can, serve in various capacities, or even do the job that you're doing. Okay. But when we think about our kids and our family, what we're doing is we're having a generational impact, a multi-generational impact, because when we are investing in our children, we're really investing in our grandchildren and in our great-grandchildren, and creating a legacy that will hopefully last for thousands of years. So that would be my suggestion. And, be there, invest. I've been a soccer coach for the last 15 years. I mean, I've coached all my kids at some stage. I've brought my kids with me on business trips. As you mentioned earlier, you met my son, Matt, when we did the first Global Home Education Conference in Germany. Matt's graduated now. And in fact, he's about to have our first grandchild.
Awesome.
It's now public, so I can say it.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. It's very exciting.
I mean, it's been so cool to see at Classical Conversations now, like people that I was homeschooled with have their kids in the program, just that generational impact. I mean, as humans, we're just dust in the wind, we're here for a very short time, and being able to have that long view of freedom and of history and of family legacy is so important, and something that homeschoolers have an opportunity to pass on in a way that's much more impactful than someone who's outsourcing a significant portion of those formidable years to an outside entity, whether it's a private school or a public school. So So join HSLDA. I mean, I always tell people to join HSLDA, and they say, well, our rights, we have the right to homeschool. It's like, well, it wasn't until 1993 until everyone in the United States had that right. We're fighting internationally. I mean, we're partners domestically, obviously helping, and internationally as well. But what specifically on the global side can a family do that's maybe listening to this and saying, we want to give to missions, or maybe we'd give to missions now, but I've never thought about giving to homeschooling and Christians across the world. So is there a way for them to be supportive of what either HSLDA is doing or GHEX?
Well, Robert, thank you for asking that question. I mean, joining HSLDA directly supports the work that we're doing here in the U.S., but also abroad. We believe that these freedoms that we enjoy here are freedoms that everyone should enjoy everywhere. I make human rights arguments. I make constitutional rights arguments. Hey, I'm a lawyer. I'm going to make whatever arguments I can to advance this amazing thing called homeschooling, no matter where I can. And, by supporting HSLDA with a membership, people are going to be able to benefit from the services that we offer. So many times I'm talking to people when they're facing a legal emergency and they're like, man, I never thought I was going to have to call you.
Right.
But we have a 24-hour emergency hotline people can call.
There's still persecution here in the United States. Let's just be clear.
There is. I mean, there is definitely a battle going on for the family, and there is state pressure. And homeschool families need to be able to turn to someone when they're confronted with that. And I mean, people, you never know when that's going to happen. Every week we are handling calls from families who are experiencing some kind of crisis at their front door because some government official shows up. Or like a month or so ago, I wrote a story about this on the website. It was one of the most read we've had in a while, about this family who gave birth in the hospital. And I mean, I was driving back from state capitol in West Virginia home, and I got a call. I'm driving up I-77, and they're like, hey, we're in the hospital, and social services just showed up because, we want to go home. And the baby was totally healthy.
Mm-hmm.
There was no problem. It was just their policy that if you didn't stay overnight, they call social services.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, that is ridiculous. So I dealt with that situation, and within a couple of hours, they were out the door. But that was so stressful for that family. And if they hadn't been able to call me, what were they going to? They were already thinking, well, I guess we have to put up with this. I guess we have to just kind of roll over. This happens all over the place. So that's just one example.
I've had 3 kids in the hospital, and the third time I was just like, we're leaving. If you want to give us the paperwork to leave, I will, but I'm not staying. They're like, well, you have to stay. It's like, well, you can try.
That's what happened here, and I'm glad they didn't do that to you, Robert. But and again, that wasn't homeschooling issue, but at HSLDA Lawyer, we have developed a practice and expertise in dealing with these kinds of situations because 30, 40 years ago, homeschoolers were having social workers show up all the time. So anyway, the point being is that when you join HSLDA, you benefit yourself, but you also, are investing in freedom for our whole movement everywhere in the world. And it's, it costs like less than a Starbucks does for a whole month practically. I mean, if you put everything in it,
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the pricing's amazing for what you get, and that, that's that peace of mind, and the fact that we need to fight the fight because, we don't have a George Soros funding our side of the effort. It's boots on the ground.
No, he's funding the other side.
Exactly.
Well, the UN report I was telling you about, and
yeah,
who do you think paid for that?
100%. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Tell us, what's the best website to go for HSLDA, and remind us your podcast name again so families can check that out.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to Robert and I today. It's been fun. I always love talking to Robert. We have just a lot of fun together when we get together. And look, if you want to learn about HSLDA, just go to hslda.org. That's where you can learn about us, hslda.org. And to learn about my podcast, just Google Homeschooling Around the World. I think it'll come up. I hope it comes up. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, I'll definitely be sharing it on my Facebook and my LinkedIn, our interview, and that was a lot of fun. And yeah, we got to do this again, Mike, for sure. So thank you so much for taking your time out of your day, and God bless and have a good one.
You too, Robert. It's been an honor talking with you today. Thanks.
We always want to practice our 15 tools of learning together, and we do that by going over one from each of the 3 stages of learning. And so the first stage is the 5 core habits of grammar, the grammar stage, and that's the repetition that builds knowledge. And one of those habits is storytelling. And I love starting off the interview by hearing Mike tell a story of his family's schoolhouse Airbnb and renovating it. And I'm sure it's awesome to be able to be a homeschooler and live that one-room schoolhouse lifestyle, and then be able to remodel one and just think about education and how it was, 100, 200 years ago. In the 5 common topics of dialectic, the questions that develop understanding, the tool that we'll talk about is testimony. And I just loved how Mike talked about being financially supportive of his wife's desire to homeschool, and that it brought them closer over the years, and that he was just encouraging dads to just sign the check as a great way to remind us that being invested in the education of our children doesn't have to be complicated to be meaningful. And of course, I take it as just sign the check doesn't necessarily mean monetary checks, but being able to just invest in your wife and listen to her and her guidance in the homeschooling and being invested in that. And finally, the 5 canons of rhetoric, the artifact that demonstrates wisdom. The tool is Memoria. And Mike used Memoria as he told us about the hardships of homeschoolers over the past few decades, especially internationally, and reminding us that freedom is not the natural state of things. And he encourages us to continue our fight for our educational rights and our educational freedom, both here in the U.S. and abroad. Next, we're going to talk about using these tools with a current event and talking about energy, because it's on everybody's mind and in everybody's pocketbook. I want to take a quick minute to tell you about Actors Bible, a web-based app that retells the narrative of the scripture through dramatic scenes your family can reenact. Using your desktop, tablet, or smartphone, you can select a teleprompter script of a Bible story for you and your family to act out so you can learn God's Word in a fun and interactive way. And even better, I've got a discount for you. You can go to actors.bible/rhetoric for a 15% discount for life. I hope you enjoyed talking about homeschooling, and especially international homeschooling with Mike Donnelly. I know that I so enjoy him and just the work that he's done around the world. And you can also catch me on his podcast on an upcoming episode as well. And we talk about a whole lot of different things. So be sure to check that out as well. Today, we're doing part 2 of our energy conversation and how to approach things that are going on in this world from a classical perspective, practicing these 15 tools of learning that we teach our students and our families here at Classical Conversations. And so we looked a little bit on how to define energy, looked at the sources of energy in the last episode. And in today's episode, we're really going to talk about consumers of energy. And so let's talk about circumstances, which is one of the 5 common topics of dialectic. What are some circumstances that you use energy? Like what's its purpose? What are its benefits? What would be a good use? How do you know that energy is being provided well to you as a consumer? And those are things that you can define to help you think about energy from a consumption standpoint. And you're going to define, what are those different types of consumers and those different types of energy that can be consumed. What are those benefits and what are the maybe downfalls or negative side? Because that's what that conversation that we're having in society is really about, is that, is solar power better than gas power? Or is water or wind power superior to propane? And so we need to think about what are those sources of consumers of energy and then what their needs are. And think about in attending as well, which is one of the 5 core habits of grammar. What are those different forms of energy? I remember growing up that my dad always made sure we turned out all the lights. And you probably had a similar experience, or if you're a parent, you're making sure that your kids turn all the lights out because electricity isn't free. Think about the different type of energy and different ways we treated energy when you were a kid versus the way that we treat it now. And so those are some things that you can think about to approach energy from a classical perspective, from the consumer end user standpoint, that'll help you engage in the conversation that we're having as a culture about our sources of energy and what's best for our planet, what's best for mankind, and what it means to be a good steward of the creation God's given us.
Will McCreary here again, bringing you another session on crypto today. Big shout out to the Robert Borton Show. Robert has had some amazing guests on. I've really enjoyed all of the segments so far, and some big names are reaching out, which means there's a lot more incredible content coming your way. Please stay tuned for that. Today on Classical Crypto with Will, we are finally covering NFTs. Now, I would say that NFTs are just starting to hit mainstream, and realistically, we're pretty early still. So jumping onto the NFT boat or just understanding them today will put you ahead of the game. Soon, I believe everyone will know what an NFT is. Because I've had so many people reach out to me asking me to cover NFTs, I'm going to break up this topic into two parts. Now for the big question, what is an NFT? NFT is an acronym for non-fungible token. A non-fungible token is a non-interchangeable unit of data stored on a blockchain that can be sold and traded. NFTs are tokenized as digital files such as photos, videos, or audio. Because each token is uniquely identifiable, NFTs differ from blockchain technologies such as Bitcoin. Think of it this way. A true cryptocurrency token has equal value to the next. Just as you could swap a $5 bill for another $5 bill and have the same value, you could exchange one Bitcoin for another Bitcoin and it'll still hold the same value. Unlike that, one NFT token could be vastly different from the next NFT token in the same collection. And that's what makes NFTs unique. Now, maybe that made sense. Don't feel bad if you're still scratching your head. The digital landscape is very complicated when you're just starting, but don't worry, it's not rocket science. Like anything that's semi-complicated, the more you study it or get your hands dirty with it, it'll make sense. I was trying to think of some good examples that would give a listener a grasp, and here's what I came up with. So I showed how dollars and Bitcoin is exchangeable at equal value. Think of NFTs like baseball cards. Most people understand the baseball cards concept, how they're traded, collected. A collection of baseball cards is released. Not all cards from that collection have the same value. One player may vastly outperform his peers, making his baseball card far more valuable than the rest. Additionally, sometimes the card itself may stand alone from the rest, as in most cards have a red border. You received a card with a gold border, and that was a special all-star card, all-star game, special moment, special player. Basically, it's a game of collectibles. 95% of the time, NFTs are images as opposed to videos or audio files. They're released in collections, and after their initial sale, they have very different values associated with them depending upon rarity and traits. Okay, we're getting the boring what questions answered. The next session is going to dig deep. It'll be the fun one. I'll break down the reasons why some NFTs, or just JPEGs as some would refer to them, are selling today for millions and millions of dollars a piece, and why one notable businessman is calling NFTs the biggest invention since the printing press. Join me next time on Classical Crypto with Will, and we'll start breaking down this topic. Thank you for tuning in.
Well, thank you for joining me on today's episode. I just always enjoy talking with Mike Donnelly and learning about the work at HSLDA and GHEX and just how they are on the front line of the fight for freedom, not just here in the U.S., but around the world as well. And got to practice those 15 tools of learning together, talk about energy, and of course, learn a little bit more about cryptocurrencies and what all the fuss is about them. So thank you for joining. Please share this episode with a friend, and God bless and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortons. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.